Welcome to this Women's Rights Network podcast with me, Sarah, and my guest today is Tinsel of Trans Widows Voices. Tinsel, how did you get to this point? Tell us all about Trans Widows Voices.
It all started on Mumsnet, as so many things do. In terms of Trans Widows Voices, I was a couple of years out of the breakdown of my relationship, and I was feeling that I was at a point where I could potentially help other women who were in that situation by talking to them about my own experiences, because when I was going through it myself, there was no support at all,
right,
other than the odd crumbs that were provided by trans organisations.
Right.
So, which was fairly pointless in terms of support, because obviously the purpose of support provided to trans widows by trans organisations is to try and get you to put up with the unput-upable. Tolerate the intolerable, even would be a more articulate way of saying it. So I'd had some brief excursions into that when my relationship was breaking down. One of the organisations that I found was the Women of the Beaumont Society.
Right.
And that was this is long enough ago that it was a Yahoo email group when they were still a thing.
Crikey, remember that?
And yeah, no, that's like something out of the ark. And it didn't help me at all, because it felt like it was full of women who were either in really, really teeth-grindingly miserable relationships with cross-dressers. I think this was older women. And there was I remember there being one woman who her husband's cross-dressing had escalated, and they ended up with their compromise was he was only allowed to cross-dress upstairs. So he basically lived upstairs and she lived downstairs. So there was that kind of thing that really wasn't going to help me. And then the other cohort in that group were younger women who were in abusive relationships with what I now know to be autogynephile men. So neither of that felt like it was of any help to me. Didn't say anything to me about my experiences. So I'd been through all that. Realised that there wasn't going to be any independent support for trans widows unless we did it ourselves.
Right.
Nobody was going to help us. There was no point in waiting for other people to come to our aid, because it wasn't going to happen. So I started a thread on Mumsnet, because I'd come to Mumsnet a bit earlier through the I Am Spartacus thing. I'd been on Mumsnet for a while, but not a massive Mumsnet user. But I'd been there long enough to be involved in conversations that made me realise that there were other trans widows around on Mumsnet. So I started a thread asking for, is there anybody else here? I know there's a few of you. Died a death. Got about 12 responses, none of which were from trans widows. But then a few months later, I tried it again, and it took off.
Oh, good on you for persisting.
Yes. Well, I knew that there was women there, so it took off, and there was some really fascinating conversations that happened on those early threads, which are still available on Mumsnet. If you Google Trans Widows Escape Committee Mumsnet, the threads are all still there.
What year is this?
This was at the end of 2017 that I started the first thread. So it became very interesting, because it was started entirely to be about support, for women to support each other, and it did fulfil that function. But as time went on, and partly because it was in the feminist section of Mumsnet, other women were reading it. So other women were reading the threads, and they were seeing trans widows finding each other, talking to each other, and sort of seeing it develop in real time, how all the women there were realising the commonalities of their experiences and the links to traditional cycles of domestic abuse. That was something that really came out.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the things that we had in common and the patterns that we'd been through. So other women were reading that, and accidentally it had the side effect of consciousness raising. So we started raising the consciousness of all the other women on FWR and Mumsnet about trans widows' experiences. So time went on, and I, on a whim really, started the Trans Widows Twitter account, which started to take off fairly quickly. And that was an extension of the consciousness raising side of things, because you can't do support on Twitter. And as I started having conversations with people on Twitter, I found myself saying, well, you need to read more trans widow stories, and then you'd know that that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Or you need to read more trans widow stories in order to learn more about us and understand the situation. But I didn't really have anything to point people towards to actually read trans widow stories, other than the threads on Mumsnet. And I was reluctant to do that because that was a support space. So whilst it wasn't secret, because Mumsnet's publicly accessible, it was fairly quiet. And I didn't want to start broadcasting the thread's existence and draw every trans activist onto the threads to attack us. So that was when I came up with the idea of having Trans Widows Voices website. I also felt that it was at a time when, well, it seems to continue to be a time, but a particular peak in women being banned from Mumsnet. And I thought, if all this evidence goes, then all this evidence that we've built up is going to disappear. So we need something that's owned by us, for us, and that it's unlikely will be got rid of. So I decided that there was a gap or a need for a platform to amplify trans widows' voices and enable women to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. And all I ever really wanted from the website was for people to be able to read our stories and draw their own conclusions.
Sure.
So I didn't want to have a lot of narrative of what I think. It's an evidence base for women's stories, and it's been pretty successful. I suppose it's done what I've hoped. I think there's about not quite 15 stories or thereabouts from women on the website, and a lot of women have found it really helpful to them. The women who've written the stories, they've all said that they've found it to be a really positive experience in getting it out there. And so that's how I got where I am.
And how much of what you see in what those women have written about their experience is reflected in your own?
It's an interesting thing, because my take on that is I was at I don't know how to put it, the tamer end of the spectrum of trans widow experience mainly. But then I don't know to what degree that's self-preservation on my part, or so. I mean, it was a surprise to me when I started connecting with other trans widows that the vast majority of them had very obviously AGP husbands, and the sexual component to the whole thing was very strong. And that was a surprise to me because I didn't experience that side of it.
Okay.
So but then 90% of the women who I've spoken to about it have. So I'm clearly in the minority.
Okay.
And that was something that kicked off really early in the first few posts on the escape committee threads on Mumsnet. So that side of things, but then not all of the stories on the website focus on that. the thing that we do have in common with each other, one of the main things, is the theme of boundary incursion. And that's the theme that comes up again and again when you talk to trans widows. It's all about situations where we found ourselves in situations that we weren't comfortable with. Mm-hmm. We created boundaries with the other person in order to try and manage that situation and make it acceptable for us. These were generally boundaries that will have been agreed, albeit grudgingly on one side. Mm. And it's about those boundaries being broken and renegotiated and new boundaries being made and continual incursions on what we're comfortable with. And that, to various degrees, is the theme that runs through it. It's all about our boundaries being crossed.
Would you say you could almost use the word groomed?
It's difficult when you've been in that situation. I'm still dealing with what I went through and still coming to terms with it in some ways. And I'll be 10 years on soon.
Right.
And so it's difficult to look at your own situation like that. I think it's a lot easier to see it in other people. It's easy.
That's generally true, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's much harder to see when you're in it yourself.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that it is. This is something that trans widows discuss often, is why us? What is it about us? Why did we end up in that situation? What have we got in common? And I know when I've seen some trans widows be interviewed before, the interviewers always said to them, so tell me about your childhood. And clearly the story that they want is that we were somehow broken women. We were weak and broken women who were particularly prone to be abused. And I can't help thinking that a lot of people think that we must have been a bit thick.
Well, that's one of the things about this as well, about being victims of domestic violence and so on. That, well, you're a smart woman. Why couldn't you get yourself out of it?
Yeah. Sorry, I've gone off the thread of what the question was. What was I talking about?
Oh yeah. You're pretty much going down the line that I was interested in hearing about. So you mentioned that the vast majority of the women who've written for the website, a lot of their experiences are around AGP, autogynephilia. We've mentioned that twice, but we perhaps haven't talked about what that is. And what the other side of it is. So if it's not AGP, what else is it?
Well, so do you want me to say what AGP is if people don't know what it is? I
think so, because it'd be good to hear from you what that is and what that means to trans widows.
Well, autogynephilia is a fetish where men fancy themselves as women, basically. I think literally it means like the love of oneself as a woman, but it's where men preposterously fancy themselves as women. But when I say women, that's slightly deceptive because it's more in the female role. Men are turned on by being in what they perceive to be a female role.
Almost like a stereotype?
Oh, exactly like a stereotype.
Right.
So this is why I've always said that if some people might argue that AGP can be a victimless fetish, I would argue that the whole existence of the fetish is based on the subordination of women. So, and from a sissified, stereotypical idea of what it is to be a woman. So any fetish based on the subordination of women, by definition, cannot be victimless, because it's all about subordinating women and keeping women in that role.
Yes.
Women have to be in a role where it's plausible for them to be seen to be subordinate for the fetish to exist. So yeah, it's not victimless. And it was coined by Ray Blanchard, who's an American, he's a psychotherapist who spoke to a lot of men who were cross-dressers back in the day. I have to say, my knowledge of the history of AGP is not that detailed because I don't really care.
Sure.
It's the women that I'm interested in. So people might be listening and thinking, oh, well, she's wrong about X, Y, and Z about Blanchard, but I'm generalising. So he worked with a lot of cross-dressers, and he divided them into two sets of people: homosexual transsexuals, which he said were obviously gay, but also effeminate and probably had been since childhood. Mm-hmm. And then AGPs it was a fetish. So that's where it comes from. But yeah, a lot of, and like I said, it was a surprise to me that the majority of trans widows have been in situations where they've been, to greater or lesser degrees, coerced into participating into bedroom scenarios that they're not comfortable with, and that involve something that I understand is called topping from the bottom. So topping from the bottom is where one person pretends to play a subordinate role sexually, mm-hmm. but they're actually calling all the shots and coercing. I don't suppose it's always coercive, but in this instance, coercing the other person that's involved, who's being coerced to act in a dominant way, mm-hmm. but in fact are being bullied into it. And if you have a look at the stories on the website, there's a lot of that about. And it's a really insidious form, not only of sexual abuse, but of emotional abuse. Making women play that role. There's some really nasty stuff.
Yeah, sexual, psychological, emotional abuse all the way.
And financial too, because they get into a lot of women talk about how the husbands have just frittered money away on clothes, other dressing up accoutrements, nights out with like-minded people. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on financially as well.
Thoroughly narcissistic?
Yes, completely. So I don't think all of us necessarily were married to AGPs. Probably most of us were. I think we shouldn't forget that gay men get married to women too. Mm-hmm. Some of us were married to gay men who obviously we didn't know they were gay. So some of our exes have ended up being gay. Mm. So some of them, I wonder if some of them found performing masculinity to just be too hard and performing femininity to be easier. So there is a variety of those sort of different circumstances that women find themselves in, but we find that we've got so much in common. But nobody knew that until we all started talking to each other.
Well, you see, this is why they don't want women to go out and have lunch, because we actually talk to each other.
No, and this is the whole point of consciousness raising. Women talking to each other is a really powerful thing.
Very.
Right from the days
of women with pockets who talk to each other.
Yeah, which is why our exes and their allies really, really don't like us talking to each other, and don't like us speaking publicly to other women about our experiences, because we show the lie behind the glitter, and it's very, very inconvenient for them. We're the women who said no, and we keep on saying no, mm-hmm. and men don't like being said no to. We really don't like it.
Do you think it also makes some of the women in, let's perhaps call it the GC movement or feminist movement, do you think it makes them uncomfortable as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Your level of truth telling, because it's absolute truth.
Yes. Trans widows have been mostly excluded from the sort of the public face of gender critical feminist activism. Mainly that has been done by our exes and men of their ilk being platformed instead of us. I mean, I say instead of us because you can only have one or the other. And so I've been saying for a number of years now that feminist groups platforming trans widows, exes, excludes trans widows. And for a long time, that was kind of an analogy because it wasn't actually our exes that they were platforming, it was men like our exes.
Sure.
Although only of the women that I know, I'm sure the ones that have been platformed have got wives and exes. I mean, I know some of, certain one of them has a wife. So that, like I say, it had been an analogy almost until recently, and it's always nice to be proved right. I was contacted recently by a woman who I'd known her previously as a trans widow, who, I won't say where it is that she lives because it's quite outing, but it's a small and quite isolated part of the UK.
Okay.
And it was International Women's Day, and she found out that her ex-husband was at a feminist event in their town square talking about the inclusion of women like him in feminism on International Women's Day. So how's that woman supposed to go to her local feminist group when it's got her husband on stage?
And could that not be, for some women, just thoroughly re-traumatizing?
Yes, 100%. Now, granted, this was a liberal feminist group and not a gender critical feminist group, but the gender critical feminist groups have done it as well. And one thing I liken it to is there's this concept that of the reasonable transsexual who's an ally. And so we have the reasonable transsexual who is apparently on our side. And I think a good way to look at it is to imagine the reasonable wife beater. So when you look at trans widow stories and see that by and large we're mostly talking about domestic abuse.
Yes.
So imagine if there was a conference by a charity that was against wife beating, with an audience full of women, and on stage we had somebody who purported to be a reasonable wife beater who just thought that all this wife beating had got a bit out of hand and that we should keep wife beating within certain acceptable limits, and these new upstart wife beaters were giving all the reasonable wife beaters a bad name. How would women in the audience who've been beaten be expected to sit there and listen to that? And how would the actual wife of the man on stage talking about how he was a reasonable wife beater be expected to get involved in that at all? And how would she not feel alienated and gaslighted?
I think it's a really powerful analogy. And then you could say, well, who would argue that wife beating is innate?
Yes. Well, apparently these things are innate now. So we've seen a shift, a really, 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 really disturbing shift, in my view, recently. From, obviously, they had a go at Born in the Wrong Body, and they ran with Born in the Wrong Body for quite a long time until it didn't fly.
No, it hit a
So
bit more, didn't it?
Yeah, they had to give up on Born in the Wrong Body. I think even Mermaids reports to have given.
Yeah, even when they quit it, it's not. Yeah.
So they were the very final rats to leave the ship as the very last part of it sank, as the SS Born in the Wrong Body went down. So I can't really continue the sinking ship analogy. That's as far as I can take it.
Fair enough.
But so now we've gone from that to the new thing, which is innate fetishes. So born with a fetish. So this idea, I mean, and I think it's probably being said for all fetishes, but I don't spend my time studying fetishes because it's another thing I'm not interested in. But this idea that AGP is innate. So we're starting to hear men with AGP saying, I knew I'd got it when I was 3. I was 3 and I heard the word tights and it gave me a thrill. And I've felt such thrills about tights ever since. Clearly, I was born with it. And it's just not true. When you, putting aside all the arguments that are being made about child development, which I'm not an expert in, but when you listen to the testimonies of these men, which, I mean, they're never 100% honest, but there are some themes that run through them. It's always, it emerges in sort of early teenage years, and it's a fetish that's reinforced by masturbation. That's not something that children are born with. I mean, there's a whole dodgy agenda of trying to frame children in that way. But I suppose my interest in it is, where does that leave trans widows? Well, because we've got a movement who, by and large, would find it acceptable for us to leave that situation, because we all agree that men are not women based on lady feels. That's accepted within this movement. But now, if we have acceptable fetishes, acceptable abusive fetishes, where does that leave trans widows? So what we're supposed to put up with it because the poor dears can't help it?
Yes, you are, clearly.
Yeah, so we'd then be expected to accommodate that in some way. And
it fits in, doesn't it, with this idea that's been kind of touted before, and lots of people have accepted it, because we be kind, because, you know, we want to show how liberal we are and all the rest of it, that it's people can do what they want behind closed doors, and it's other people's business what they do in private. And people can wear what they like. Famous tweet by a famous woman. Where, you know, dress as you please, wear what you like. But as you mentioned before, the men that Ray Blanchard was seeing coming across his door were cross-dressers. Or what we used to call transvestites.
Who apparently have all disappeared now.
And what this is sounding a lot like to me is they're still here doing the same thing but under a different name.
It's been rebranded.
It's a clever marketing.
It's a rebranding of the same old misogyny. And there's a dynamic that I've noticed amongst gender critical feminists. I've always said that the path to hell is paved with the intention of not appearing transphobic, and a lot of women are understandably very concerned about not being seen as transphobic, so they're keen to support gender nonconformity. Say it's not gender nonconformity that I've got a problem with, it's men saying that they're women. So it sounds all very well in theory when you say wear what you like, but trans widows' experiences show that it's based on quite a naive understanding of what motivates men to wear women's clothes, because they're not wearing our yoga pants and our saggy cardies and our t-shirts. They're wearing high heels and suspenders. There was a story. It was funny, but it was bizarre. It was a really bizarre couple of days. It was a year or so ago. There was a story, and I think it was the Daily Mirror, about a man who worked for Tesco's, and he'd got permission from Tesco's management to wear a skirt, to wear the women's uniform instead of the men's uniform. And so he was saying, I know I'm not a woman, I just feel more comfortable in women's clothes. And so feminists on Twitter were queuing up to say, isn't this marvellous? We should see more of this. All power to his elbow. This is how things should be. Just because he was saying that he didn't think he was a woman. And I spent like 2 days on Twitter going, for the love of God, use your eyes and your reading comprehension. because if you read the story, he admitted all of the usual patterns of how it developed, like stealing his ex-girlfriend's clothes, which they all talk about.
Right.
It's either the mum's clothes, the sister's clothes, or ex-girlfriend's clothes. So it was there in black and white, but also in the pictures, he wasn't just wearing a skirt, he was wearing a padded bra and tights.
Oh my God.
In shoes.
Well, that's not comfortable all day.
No.
I'd rather wear trousers and trainers, frankly, if I'm all day on the shop floor.
Yeah. So he was an AGP man pulling the wool over women's eyes in the way that AGP men do. And this is something that has also struck me about this born with a fetish narrative. It's reproducing on a macro level the grooming and gaslighting that trans widows went through on a micro level. And we're saying this is what happened to us. AGP doesn't march into your life wearing thigh boots and a suspender belt. It's introduced gradually. Yeah. And that's how we end up married to these men.
Water is slowly boiled.
Yeah. We don't marry the man in the thigh boots and the suspender belt.
No.
We marry the man who then admits that he likes dressing up in women's clothes occasionally.
Which, I mean, we've talked about the men a lot, and obviously we want to be even more interested in the women and the trans widows. And what that makes me then think about is spousal consent.
Yeah.
So what kind of power, what kind of autonomy, where do women stand legally who are in these relationships, trying to get out of these relationships, and what can we women, those in the Women's Rights Network, those in other who are involved in other campaigns and other groups, what can we do to support trans widows and even perhaps try and change laws that you might regard as bad laws that are actually propping this stuff up?
Well, the law as it stands in relation to practice to spousal consent in England and Wales is pretty good, which is why trans widows' voices campaigns to retain the law as it is. So there's been massive amounts of propaganda about the spousal veto. The spousal veto doesn't exist. There isn't a veto. We prefer to call it the spousal exit clause because I thought, well, let's reframe it from the women's perspective, because there's two people in this situation. Exactly. And the purpose of it is to allow women to exit the marriage. I'm talking about it in terms of women and men because that's my interest, but that's not the only time that it's applicable. So the current law stands that if your husband applies for a gender recognition certificate, then in order for him to get that GRC, you have to either consent to the marriage continuing, or if you don't, and then he can get the GRC, or if you don't want to be married to somebody with the GRC, you end the marriage. If you object to it, an interim gender recognition certificate is issued, and that can be used by either party as grounds to annul the marriage. So what it means is that nobody can end up married to somebody who's legally a different sex to the person that they married unless they consent to it. Mm-hmm. Seems entirely reasonable. And the key thing is that either party can end the marriage. So this whole myth of the spousal veto that's been put about by everybody under the sun, driven by some of the original trans rights activists through Press for Change and organisations like that, but taken on by Stonewall, and then all the organisations who are Stonewall champions got involved. Yeah. So we even had Nat West Bank taking part in a government consultation saying that trans widows' rights should be taken away. All the unions,
it's just bizarre.
All of the major political parties, apart from the Conservatives, are all in favour of abolishing what they see as spousal veto.
And this is a small oppressed minority, you know.
Yes, yeah, with everybody on their side. And it's only recently that people have realised that there needs to be there's two parties in this situation, and both of them should be considered. And that's
Exactly.
all we're asking for is equal consideration. But male entitlement is a powerful thing.
Very.
And men don't want to have no said to them and don't want to be delayed in their stunning and brave journey. So I think that's part of the reason for the myth of the spousal veto. The other part of it is that it stands in the way of self-ID. So you have to get rid of the spousal exit clause to be able to have self-ID, because a married man can't self-ID into legal womanhood if his wife can put a brake on that process.
And who would want to let a woman have that much power?
No. And there's an irony in some respects in the gay rights, the now trans rights organisations being involved in this, because it affects gay people as well, because it's applicable to civil partnerships. So, and I would have thought that after heterosexual women, the other main cohort of people who will be affected by this will be lesbian women, because I would imagine that there's a considerable number of women in lesbian, same-sex marriages or civil partnerships who have a female partner who transitions and who are going to end up being potentially legally married to a man.
Good point.
And lesbian trans widows is something that we just do not hear about.
Doubly invisible.
Yeah. And, if you're talking about, let's listen to the voices, let's seek out the women whose voices we don't hear and listen to them. We don't hear the voices of lesbian trans widows at all. It's something that I found very frustrating. It's difficult for me to properly understand because I'm not a lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult for me to understand the dynamics. But, Sheila Jeffries was talking about this in Gender Hurts, 10 years or so ago.
Oh, the lesbians have been ahead of this stuff for decades.
Yeah, but but she was talking, she was brilliant on heterosexual trans widows, but she was also talking about lesbian trans widows, and about how women were being sort of made straight. But there was a perception that lesbians whose partners transition now had to be seen as straight, and so they were losing their community. If they'd been in a big part of the LGBT community, they felt they didn't fit in there anymore, and all of the problems that caused. So it's not something that's not known about, but it's not spoken about. I found it really frustrating that the new LGBT organisations that have sprung up are not interested in lesbian trans widows at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to talk with anybody, or is it just attempts to engage on social media? Has there been any?
I and other people have contacted them privately, and it's just not something that they're interested in.
Why do you think that is? I guess you can't know, but
I can speculate. I think partly it's because, similar to main gender critical feminist groups, they've got reasonable transsexuals allies in their ranks, for whom they're not going to want their mates to focus on trans widows. I think also, and maybe your listeners will reel back in horror at me saying this, I think that the growing interest in detransitioners probably has a lot to do with it as well, because particularly feminist groups, and I suppose LGBT groups as well, have been paying a lot of attention to female detransitioners. So how can you be truly supportive and welcoming to female detransitioners if you're being truly welcoming and supportive to their exes? We're back to having the reasonable wife beater on the stage. So
yeah.
And it is a dynamic that I think it'll be I don't know if interesting is the right word, but it's a dynamic to watch, in that when our exes get bored of it potentially and start detransitioning, we're very keen, particularly as feminists, to welcome female detransitioners back into the fold because they're women.
Yeah.
But where does that leave the women who've been victims of it?
Oh, that's such a good point, Tinsel.
At the back of the queue again. And I think it's going to be increasingly problematic. And I wonder if, to some degree, we might end up possibly being victims of our own success in a way. Not that I'm suggesting that we should do anything differently, but as curbs and limits are put on the stunning and brave trans journey, are some men going to not find that route as attractive, and are they going to want to go back to how they were before? And then are we all? I mean, I've seen a bit of it already on Twitter.
I was going to say, have you started to see?
Yeah, I've started to see it. Although I think it's mainly probably the homosexual transsexuals that I've seen it happening with. But yeah, male detransitioners being, don't know if almost revered, like they have a lot of wisdom to pass on, and that we need to listen really hard to them. And I'm sure to some extent that's true, but what about us?
Yes.
Which we seem to be saying permanently. You know, what about us in this? I'm not sure how it's going to play out. It's definitely something to watch.
And as we're watching it, what can we, as one group of women used to say, deeds, not words, what can we be doing to support trans widows and to get the message across about the truth? Yours is a group that is saying things as it is, which actually takes a lot of courage, I think. And sometimes
I don't like being called brave, because I imagine it in a yes, Prime Minister type of way, where Sir Humphrey would say, "Oh, that's a very brave decision, Prime Minister," and he'd go, "Brave? What do you mean a brave decision?" And I feel like, brave? What do you mean I'm brave?
I see you more as a kind of Boudica, Tinsel.
Oh, right, okay.
That's what, yeah, that kind of brave. No, and also very funny, I have to say. Some of your comebacks on Twitter are hilarious and correct.
I do I think you've got to have a bit of light and shade, because otherwise it's just get very dismally depressing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So what can us women do for the women who are in this, gone through it, how to improve things for future? What can we do?
I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's something that a lot of people apparently seem to struggle with. For a feminist organisation, should be female focused.
Yes.
So keep our exes out of it, please. They might give you the opportunity to have a shield against accusations of transphobia, and to say, "Look, I'm not transphobic, this trans person agrees with me." But we're the casualties of that. And to read our stories and to take on board what we're saying. And I mean, it's preaching to the converted, I think, with the women who are in Women's Rights Network to a large degree.
Yeah, but to be fair, we're trying to reach out, hence the podcast.
Yeah.
So, there could be a woman listening right now to the podcast who is in a similar position herself. And what kind of advice would you give to her, and what could we do for a woman such as her who's stuck in that situation?
Yeah, I think on a personal level, talking about individuals rather than an organisation, it's about, if you meet a trans widow, not acting like her husband is a woman, and not not speaking about him in those terms.
Not asking if she's now a lesbian.
Yeah, I've had conversations with people when I've told them my experience. I said, oh, why did your marriage break down? And I said, oh, my husband decided he wanted to be a woman. And people have actually said to me, oh, that must have been difficult for him.
Him?
Yeah. And people are so coached to thinking about them that even when we're sat in front of them and the person that they're speaking to, they're so worried about that, in the headlights, oh, I will start sympathising with the other party. And it's no, you wouldn't meet that in any other situation where you were talking about the breakdown of your marriage. You know, if you said,
it must be difficult whilst he was beating you.
Yeah, or like he ran off with another woman. Oh, yeah. That must have been difficult for him.
Yeah.
It's preposterous, but it's like, you know, it happens. So, you know, don't do that, please, women. Don't refer to our husbands, automatically start referring to our husbands as she, because it makes our lives make no sense. And it makes our children's lives make no sense. So when you're talking to them, do whatever you like. But when you're talking to us, have some respect for our reality and our experience. The same respect that you'd show to them if you were speaking to them. So it's about a reality-based approach. And if you're a feminist or part of a feminist organisation, keeping your activism entirely female focused. It's difficult to say these things without sounding incredibly sarcastic because it's so blindingly obvious to me, but a lot of women struggle to get it. And still on Twitter and on Mumsnet, actually, there was a brief period where I felt like we'd won Mumsnet, but I mean, my friend says you have to think of it like a new year 9 coming in every year.
So again.
Yeah. Well, still, there's a lot of women who are very wedded to the idea of if somebody who's trans agrees with me, that means I'm not transphobic. And men in the movement are equally, if not more, guilty of it. Probably more. But don't be afraid of being considered to be transphobic, because we're all transphobic now. And certainly, if you are...
Reality is transphobic.
Yeah, if you're going to be worried about being transphobic, just park it when you're talking to us, is really the main thing that you can do for trans widows. And, you know, listening to our stories and not making assumptions about us.
Where can women and any other interested people, otherwise known as men, where could they go to find out more about Trans Widows' Voices?
They could go to an excellent website, www.transwidowsvoices.org. That would be my main suggestion. I mean, on our, I mean, still plugging the website, but on the resources section of the website, we've got loads of links to YouTube's podcasts, articles, books. There's a couple of good books about it, which are listed on the website.
Okay.
Read the threads on Mumsnet, the early ones. I mean, I don't want to necessarily direct women towards the later threads that are still going. But read the Trans Widows Escape Committee threads on Mumsnet.
Trans Widows Escape Committee. It's a great name.
We're on thread 5 now. But the first couple of threads, so when you think there's nearly 1,000 posts on each thread,
wow.
There's a lot of evidence there. And the value of that is, like I said before, you can see women finding each other and in real time discovering what they've got in common. As you can't fake that. There wasn't an agenda to it. It was just women finding each other and talking. So there's stuff like more and more women are talking about it now. there's been a lot of stuff on YouTube, which, like I say, there's links to on the website. Christine Benvenuto's book is excellent. It's called Sex Changes, and that's a really good account. She's an American woman who was from a liberal Jewish community, and her husband transitioned, and her liberal Jewish community would be entirely on his side.
Yeah.
And anything that she did that wasn't towing the line was sort of condemned by her community. And it's a good book. She's a writer, so she was a writer before all this. So it's a really good book. I do recommend that.
What we can do is pop into the description any of the links, your website, social media, any of the other resources or books that you recommend. So we'll pop that in the description so women can take a look.
Okay.
Tinsel, thank you very much for talking to us on the Women's Rights Network podcast.
Thank you for having me.